My wedding was supposed to be perfect. White roses, a fancy venue, and a crowd of guests ready to watch me, a millionaire, marry a girl from the other side of town. But it all fell apart the moment my bride took the microphone and started speaking. At first, it sounded like a heartfelt confession, but with every word, my life flipped further upside down. You'd think it couldn't get worse. But what happened next left everyone in the room completely stunned. Let me start from the very beginning. Let me tell you, my life wasn't exactly a fairy tale before I met her. Scratch that, it was more like a really bad reality show where the only prize was a giant headache. My name's Eric Lancaster, I'm 34, and yes, I'm one of those self-made millionaires you hear about on motivational podcasts. But don't roll your eyes just yet. I'm not the type who writes books titled 10 Steps to Success. No, my life's a little messier than that. It all started a year ago, on what should have been a regular Tuesday. I had just wrapped up another soul-draining board meeting, the kind where people talk a lot but say nothing. My assistant, Jenny, suggested grabbing a bite at this hole-in-the-wall diner downtown. She called it charming. I called it definitely failed a health inspection. The moment I walked in, though, I saw her, Rachel. She was carrying a tray of food, balancing it like a pro while dodging some kid throwing ketchup packets around. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and she wasn't wearing any makeup, just her natural self. But there was something about the way she smiled, like she didn't care how chaotic the place was. She had this air of confidence that said, yeah, life's a mess, but I've got this. It wasn't the type of girl I usually went for, and maybe that's exactly why I couldn't stop staring. Now, let's get one thing straight. I'm not the smoothest guy when it comes to dating. Sure, I can close $1 million deal, but asking for a phone number? That's a whole different skill set. So, naturally, when she came to take my order, I blurted out something brilliant like, do you, recommend the food? She raised an eyebrow and gave me this half smile, like she was trying not to laugh. Well, considering this is a diner, I'd say food is kind of our thing, but sure, the burgers won't kill you. Jenny kicked me under the table, probably to save me from embarrassing myself further. But Rachel, she didn't seem bothered. She jotted down our order and walked off, leaving me sitting there like some lovesick teenager. Over the next few weeks, I kept finding excuses to go back to that diner. Their coffee's great, I'd tell my friends. Lies, it was barely drinkable. But every visit gave me another chance to talk to Rachel. I learned that she was 26, lived in a tiny apartment on the rougher side of town, and worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Her dream? To open her own bakery someday. It wasn't some grand, world-changing goal, but the way she talked about it, you'd think she was planning to start a revolution. She had passion, and that was rare. Of course, not everyone in my life was thrilled about her. My sister Cynthia was the first to throw shade. "Eric, darling," she said one evening over dinner, swirling her wine like a villain in a soap opera. "She's lovely, I'm sure, but do you really think she's right for you?" Translation: she's not rich enough, polished enough, or from the right family. Cynthia had this talent for turning simple words into daggers. But I wasn't about to let her opinion dictate my life. Rachel was different, and I liked that. Fast forward 6 months, and we were inseparable. Sure, she had her secrets. Who doesn't? But I figured everyone deserves a little privacy. She didn't talk much about her past, and every time I brought it up, she'd change the subject. "Why dwell on the past when the future's so bright?" she'd say with that killer smile of hers. It worked every time. When I proposed, it wasn't some grand gesture with fireworks and a string quartet. It was just the 2 of us, sitting on a park bench, eating ice cream. I pulled out the ring, and before I could even get the words out, she said yes. No hesitation, no drama. It felt right. But now, standing at the altar, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling. My sister's words kept echoing in my head. "Do you really think you know her?" I tried to push the doubts away, but they clung to me like static electricity. Rachel, on the other hand, looked calm as ever. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, like she owned the place. The ceremony started smoothly enough. The vows were heartfelt, the guests were teary-eyed, and the whole thing felt like a dream. But just as Rachel took the microphone to say her vows, she paused. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Cynthia for a split second before returning to me. And then she said, "Before I continue, there's something I need to share with everyone." The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. My heart sank and my mind raced. What could she possibly have to say right now? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. This wedding was about to take a turn I never saw coming. Rachel stood there, holding the microphone like it was her lifeline. Her eyes scanned the room again, and for the first time since I met her, she looked unsure, like she was gearing up to jump into a pool without knowing if there was water at the bottom. "I need to be honest," she started, her voice steady but softer than usual. "There's something about me that none of you know, not even Eric. Now, let me tell you, nothing kills the vibe at a wedding like the bride dropping a mystery bombshell." My mom clutched her pearls. Yes, she actually does that. It's her thing. Cynthia leaned forward like she was watching the season finale of her favorite drama, and the rest of the guests were frozen in place, waiting for whatever fireworks were about to go off. Rachel took a deep breath and continued. "I've always believed in being honest, but sometimes life makes that hard. So before I commit to spending the rest of my life with this amazing man, I want him and all of you to know who I really am. Great, just great." My mind was racing at about 100 miles per hour. Was she secretly married? Was this some kind of elaborate reality show prank? I glanced over at Cynthia, who looked like she was one smug smile away from bursting into applause. Meanwhile, Rachel stayed calm, her voice growing stronger. "I grew up in a neighborhood where life wasn't easy," she said, glancing at a couple of guests who were clearly whispering to each other. "My mom worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. My dad, well, let's just say he wasn't around much. I had to grow up fast, and sometimes that meant making tough choices." She paused, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a butter knife. Cynthia couldn't resist. She muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, here we go, the sob story." Rachel didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a small, calm smile that somehow managed to shut Cynthia up. "I made mistakes," she admitted, "big ones. But every decision I made was because I believed I was protecting my family. Maybe it wasn't always the right thing to do, but I've learned from it." At this point, the crowd was split. Some people looked sympathetic, nodding as if they understood. Others were exchanging skeptical glances, clearly wondering where this was going. And then Rachel dropped the hammer. "When I was 19, I got caught up in something I didn't fully understand. I trusted the wrong people, made a bad call, and, well, let's just say the consequences were serious." Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied herself. "I was charged with fraud for something I thought was harmless, and yes, I paid the price. I served my time." The room erupted into murmurs. My mom looked like she might faint, my dad just shook his head, and Cynthia? She was practically glowing. "I knew it," she whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "I knew she was hiding something." I stood there, trying to process what I'd just heard. My fiancé, no, my wife-to-be, had just confessed to being a convicted criminal. At our wedding, in front of everyone. Talk about a plot twist. But Rachel wasn't done. She turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine. "Eric, I know this isn't what you expected to hear today, and I understand if you're angry, hurt, or even reconsidering everything. But I couldn't marry you without being completely honest. You deserve the truth." The guests were dead silent. Even Cynthia had stopped smirking, probably because she was too busy calculating how much drama she could squeeze out of this later. My head was spinning. On one hand, I felt like I'd been sucker punched. On the other hand, she was standing there, completely vulnerable, owning up to her past in a way most people never could. And then, before I could say anything, Cynthia stood up. "Well, isn't this just charming?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've got to hand it to her, she's got guts. But Eric, let's be real. Do you really want to marry someone who's been to jail? Think about the headlines." I turned to her, feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion. "Cynthia, sit down. You've had your moment." Rachel didn't even blink. She just looked at me, waiting for my response. The silence stretched on, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room watching me like I was the main act in a circus. Finally, I spoke. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "You should have told me sooner, but the fact that you're standing here, owning up to everything, says more about you than your past ever could." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Not the dramatic kind, but the real, raw kind that hit you right in the gut. The guests let out a collective sigh, half in relief, half in surprise. Cynthia, on the other hand, looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon. But before we could even think about moving forward, Rachel added, "There's one more thing." The room went silent again. My heart sank. One more thing? Are you kidding me? I braced myself because whatever was coming next, I had a feeling it was going to make everything that just happened look like a warm-up act. The room went so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Rachel's words, "There's one more thing," hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. I glanced at the crowd. Half the guests looked like they were about to faint. The other half leaned forward like they were binge-watching their favorite drama. Cynthia, predictably, sat there smirking like she'd just won a game she didn't even know she was playing. Rachel, still holding the mic, took a deep breath. "I promise this is the last thing I'll say, and I'm saying it because I love Eric and he deserves to know everything." At this point, my nerves were shot. Seriously, my brain was doing backflips trying to figure out what could possibly be worse than what she'd already confessed. A double life, secret kids, witness protection. My imagination was running wild, and judging by the whispers in the room, I wasn't the only one. Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady but her eyes glistening. "When I said I was caught up in something I didn't fully understand, I wasn't just talking about the charges. The truth is, the people I got involved with weren't exactly the kind you walk away from easily." My stomach dropped. "Here we go." "They were, let's just say, very persuasive," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "When everything fell apart, I didn't just have to deal with the legal system. I had to start over, completely. New city, new job, new life." The room erupted into murmurs again. My mom looked like she was doing mental gymnastics trying to figure out what Rachel was implying. Cynthia, meanwhile, sat there with her arms crossed, clearly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Rachel's gaze never left mine. "Eric, the reason I've been so guarded about my past isn't just because of my mistakes. It's because I've spent years making sure those mistakes didn't follow me here. I didn't want them to touch you, or your family, or anyone else I care about. I felt like I'd been hit by a freight train. On one hand, I wanted to yell, 'Why didn't you tell me any of this sooner?' On the other hand, she looked so vulnerable standing there, like she'd been carrying this weight alone for far too long. I couldn't even imagine what it must have been like to live with that kind of fear every day." Cynthia, of course, decided this was the perfect time to stir the pot. "So, let me get this straight," she said, her voice loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "Not only did you break the law, but now you're telling us there's some shadowy group of people who might just show up at our doorstep one day? Lovely." Rachel turned to her, calm but firm. "That's not going to happen. I made sure of it. I've worked hard to leave that part of my life behind. But I couldn't keep this from Eric any longer." All eyes were on me now. I could feel the weight of their stares, some judgmental, some sympathetic, and a whole lot of them just plain curious. Rachel stood there, waiting. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She just stood there, letting me process everything she'd just dropped on me. And then it hit me. This wasn't just about her past. It was about trust. About whether I could look past everything she'd been through and still see the woman I'd fallen in love with. I took a step toward her. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling around me. "You've been through hell and you came out stronger. I can't say I understand everything you've gone through, but I know one thing. I love you. And if you're willing to face your past, then so am I." The room let out a collective gasp. Cynthia actually dropped her jaw, which was a first. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, happy ones this time, and before I knew it, she was in my arms. But just as the tension started to fade, one of the guests, an older man I didn't recognize, stood up. "Well, isn't this touching?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let me ask you this, Rachel. How sure are you that your past is really behind you?" The room froze again. Rachel's face went pale. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man smirked. "Let's just say I know a thing or two about your friends from back in the day." At that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't just a dramatic wedding confession. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And as Rachel tightened her grip on my hand, I realized one thing. No matter what came next, we'd face it together. The wedding wasn't the fairy tale ending we'd planned, but it was real. Messy, complicated, and full of unexpected twists, just like life. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. If I were in Eric's shoes, I'd like to think I'd do the same, stand by Rachel, and face whatever challenges came our way. Her honesty and courage to own her past are rare and admirable, even if the timing wasn't ideal. Love isn't just about celebrating the good, it's about standing strong together when things get tough. What about you? How would you handle a situation like this? Do you think Eric made the right call, or would you have walked away? Share your thoughts. Comment if you've faced something similar or know someone who has. Don't forget to like this post if you found the story engaging or thought-provoking. This story was created with the hope of shedding light on real issues and sparking meaningful conversations. Together, we can make the world a little kinder and more understanding. Your opinion matters. Let's make a difference.